In 2009, the High Court in London delivered a landmark ruling in favour of a group of parents from the former steelworks town of Corby. The court held that the local authority was liable for the negligent disposal of toxic waste during the reclamation of the steelworks, which exposed pregnant mothers to air pollution and led to children being born with lifelong disabilities. The mother's tireless fight for justice was recently made into a popular Netflix drama, Toxic Town. While an out-of-court settlement was reached, these issues are far from settled. The next generation of parents are again seeking justice, this time for suspected clusters of rare childhood cancers on residential estates where toxic waste may have been illicitly disposed of. Other campaign groups suspect exposure to toxic waste has resulted in clusters of adult cancers and high rates of infant mortality. Corby residents are now calling for a public inquiry to find out where toxic waste was disposed of and what corresponding intergenerational injuries may have been caused. These issues are close to my heart. Corby is my hometown, and my council estate is an area that's likely affected by this waste scandal. Like many in Corby, my father worked in the steelworks. He worked in the coke ovens without adequate protective gear, and he died of lung cancer in the years that followed. The toxic harms stemming from the steelworks live on. Today, I draw on previous research I conducted in Corby, which looked at conflict and crime on my housing estate. I return to this work to rethink the concept of violence and to reflect on the disjuncture between how violence is defined in law and the reality of violence as lived. Under the criminal law in England and Wales, violence is primarily conceptualised as interpersonal. Hence, the criminal law tends to respond when individuals use physical force against other individuals. When violence is conceptualised this way, it's situated among socially disadvantaged groups. This conception of violence can be seen as distinctively modern, rooted in Enlightenment thinking. Prior to the 17th century, what we would today deem violent behaviour was often socially accepted as a valid form of expression in English society, and the use of force was widespread throughout the social order. For example, masters used force against their servants, the patriarchal head of house used force against his wife, the wife against her children and servants, and so forth. Dueling and other forms of fighting were also legitimate ways to maintain order and to attain social standing. But as new bourgeois ideas spread about the virtuous, rational man, attitudes towards violence and its social meaning began to change. Instead of holding certain displays of aggression in moral regard, Enlightenment scholars conceptualized physical force in terms of the animalistic, impulsive, and primitive tendencies of man. Rather than relying on brute strength to settle matters, the new moral man became someone who relied on reason to overcome conflict. Legal and trading mechanisms facilitated by the modern state have gradually replaced overt uses of violence by propertied actors. Instead of needing to use direct force, the modern state makes it possible for those with wealth to impose their will and to assert power over others in different ways. For example, instead of using physical force to make people labour, as was widely done in the past, here think of the chains of slavery and the bloody code, imbalanced labour contracts, high costs of living, the stigmatisation of welfare and so on, perform this coercive function indirectly. Moreover, in the 19th century, the English middle class were increasingly encouraged to take their disputes to newly established police forces. In this way, the state could resolve problems on behalf of wealthy individuals, which further decreased the need for them to take force into their own hands. However, for the most marginalised in English society, the police have never been a genuine source of support. As Stuart Hall and colleagues explain, in a class society based on the needs of capital and the protection of private property, the poor and propertyless are always, in some sense, on the wrong side of the law, whether they actually transgress it or not. Without recourse to state support, the most socially economically disadvantaged have continued to rely on personal uses of force to defend themselves and their families. While the middle class can rely on the state to protect their interests, the poor must rely on themselves and on each other. A consequence of these developments is that violence, as conceived by the criminal law, is primarily situated, as I remarked earlier, within and among the most socio-economically disadvantaged sectors of English society. Violence is consigned to certain people and places, such as my council estate in Corby, which developed a reputation as a rough, no-go area. The local press branded the estate in a state of fear. When the steelworks closed down in 1980, unemployment engulfed Corby. Around 20,000 people, which was more than 30% of the town's population, lost their jobs, which gave Corby the second highest rates of unemployment in the UK. The injuries of unemployment went further and were worsened by government policies such as the right to buy of council housing. Those who could afford to buy tended to purchase property, council housing, in more desirable areas. Meanwhile, less desirable housing on estates like mine largely remained unsold, which left the estate to become an area of concentrated disadvantage, preserved for those who couldn't access the spoils of privatisation. My estate became a place where the most vulnerable were housed without access to social amenities or welfare support. Under the weight of shame and stigma, heroin addiction took hold on the estate, and with this, interpersonal violence became pervasive. Several distressing homicides occurred on the estate over the years. Each time the offending party and their family's name was displayed in the press, the offender was required to take full responsibility for the crime, and lengthy time was served for the wrongs committed. This picture of violence is likely a familiar one, and one we have come to expect the criminal law to respond to. Toxic Town reveals a different side of violence. The enlightened moral idea of the rational man, who controls his passions and restrains himself from fighting, was further characterized as self-made, self-sufficient, and personally responsible for his life choices. This moral character was contrasted with the immoral antithesis, that of the shy and work-shy and dependent other. This character was, however, somewhat novel. Prior to the 16th century, poverty was seen through the lens of innocence in England, and giving charity to the poor was encouraged as the morally right thing to do, the good Christian thing to do. But this started to change when notions of individual autonomy developed. Under this new moral framework, poverty was divided into two classifications. First, there was the moral poor, who experienced poverty due to no fault of their own and who genuinely deserve support in times of need. Second, there was the immoral poor, who were presented as lazy, fraudulent, and as choosing not to work. The narrative of the immoral poor rang loud, and poverty was increasingly treated in terms of dishonesty and criminality. Subsequently, the state developed the notorious poor laws and corresponding workhouses to punish the poor and to deter people from displaying dependency. While the criminalisation of poverty is less explicit today, at least than it was in the 19th century, suspicions about unemployment, disability, and the immoral poor continue to circulate and harm populations. Indeed, in the last decade and a half, austerity, followed by the continued withdrawal of welfare support for persons living with disability, has had devastating effects. Research has recorded that many people targeted by these policies have faced untimely death. Throughout this time, disability has been demonised by state policy and news media discourse. Myths about persons living with disability being disingenuous have been widely circulated and then compounded by media frenzies about so-called benefit scroungers. And the stigmatisation of disability extends to unemployment too. Despite unemployment and insecure labour being built into the modern global economies, unavoidable periods of unemployment are blamed on the worker. Ideas about people choosing not to work come to the fore of explanations, and those experiencing periods of unemployment must carry the shame. What is more, the harmful effects of industrial and low-paid work on employees' health, which are well documented, whether it's the permanent bodily injuries caused by repetitive activity on the factory assembly line or daily exposure to toxic chemicals in industrial warehouses, Ill health and premature death are part and parcel of the working lives of the least advantaged, that are, the type of work they're forced to undertake. And as Steve Toombs puts it, work kills. Yet when workers inevitably fall ill, when their bodies can no longer carry them through the day, instead of receiving gratitude for their sacrifices and contributions, the injured worker is once again demonized. When the worker falls ill, they must carry the blame. They smoked, they failed to look after their bodies, they ate bad food, they didn't exercise enough. The underlying message is that the worker, now spat out of the capitalist system of labour, brought their untimely, often painful deaths on themselves. Some studies record workplace exposure to carcinogenic substances as the second biggest cause of lung cancer. The prevalence of lung cancer in Corby is significantly higher than the national average. According to a local health report, between 1993 and 2010, the average rates of lung cancer in Corby were 50% higher than the national average. There was recently a class action lawsuit in Corby brought against the insurers of British Steel on account of the company's failure to provide steelworkers with adequate protective equipment, which exposed the workforce to substances known to seriously harm their health. These hazardous working conditions contributed to the development of severe lifelong conditions and fatal cancers, especially in former steelworkers who were based in the coke ovens. Yet, when a lung cancer screening service was finally brought to Corby in 2019, a GP quoted in the local paper offered this thought. The GP said, "We know that many people in our town have been smokers and that this increases the risk of breathing problems and lung diseases as well as cancers." The hazardous working conditions and more recent exposure of residents in Corby to toxic waste was silenced. My father received his lung cancer diagnosis in 2015. When the doctor broke the news, he explained that my father had tumours in both his lungs and that the cancer had spread to his lymph nodes. He was terminally ill. Before the news sank in, the doctor had already moved on. He asked my father if he'd ever smoked. When my father said yes, the doctor replied, "Well then, smoking causes cancer." The shock of the moment forced me into silence. I couldn't find the words to speak up for my dad. I didn't explain that he quit smoking 30 years before, that he used to work in the coke ovens of the works, where he'd regularly cough up mucus and blood during his shifts. In the silence, my father was left to carry the blame and shame for the painful, premature death that lay ahead. People in Corby have had to carry the stigma and responsibility for so much. In contrast, there has been a marked absence of state accountability for the injuries that state policies have caused. Policies on housing that have led to stark inequalities, policies on welfare that demonise disability and unemployment, policies on work which leave employees in precarious contracts exposed to hazardous working conditions, and economic and planning policies that have exposed communities to toxic waste and injuries still to be known. The toxic waste scandal highlighted by Toxic Town is yet another layer of harm woven into a complex tapestry of enduring state injury in Corby. Parents have borne blame for and carried the trauma for their children's disabilities, illnesses, and loss of life in a town with limited provisions for maternal, general, and mental health care, all while battling job insecurity and economic instability. Despite the severity of harm stemming from state policies, such as a decision to build residential housing on brownfield land, which is potentially contaminated land, and despite the large numbers of people potentially affected by this social experiment, the violence is still to be recognised. It seems to me that the law's current conception of violence as primarily interpersonal needs to be reassessed. The law must respond better to the slow violence of toxic waste and the structural violences that compound existing harms. Thank you.